Good evening, everyone. My name is Sinead Collins, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Kishore Mahbubani Speaker Series event, where we invite our community to hear from and engage with leading thinkers and conversation shapers from Singapore and beyond. Can I ask that you just dim that light a little? And it's also very dark up here. I can barely read. Thank you. Under the theme of Inform, Innovate, Inspire, we seek to deepen our understanding of how the ambitions of our mission, thank you, to educate for peace and a sustainable future can be realized. And this evening's guest is very well placed to help us to explore the topic of peace. Professor Francesco Mancini is Vice Dean and Associate Professor in Practice at the National University of Singapore's Kuan School of Public Policy, as well as being an Adjunct Associate Professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. His work focuses on global governance, United Nations, and conflict analysis and resolution. He regularly lectures at academic institutions and presents at conferences and to governments on international peace and security interests. Before joining the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Mancini was Senior Director of Research at the International Peace Institute in New York, an independent international think tank devoted to the prevention and settlement of armed conflict. But he is not only an academic and thinker. Professor Mancini is also a practitioner. During his tenure at IPI, he conducted work in the Middle East on mediation, and in Sierra Leone and Liberia on peace operations. He's also worked on police reform in Jamaica and spent time in Cyprus working on the peace process for the reunification of the island. This evening, Professor is joined by Lauti, Sumedha, Ivan, and Lakshana, our UWC students, who are each involved in peace studies at the college, either through our Initiative for Peace program, through their Global Politics course, or through the IB Systems Transformations program. This evening, we will hear first from the professor as he shares insights from his work. Our students will then join him on stage to have a conversation focused on some questions that they have been contemplating through their studies, and they are very complex, difficult questions, so you have your work cut out for you this evening. And then we will open for questions from the audience. It only takes a few moments in Professor Mancini's company to feel his deep belief in peace as a human invention, imagined, negotiated, and rebuilt over thousands of years. I'm sure you'll all enjoy the conversation this evening, and who knows, it may inject a much-needed note of hope into our views of our collective future. Professor Mancini.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I'm just setting up. Do I just click this? No. All right, here we are. Perfect. Thank you very much. Almost 20 years ago, when I was in New York, and thinking of writing a book about peace building, I got an advice from my publisher. Don't mention peace in the title. Mention war. But peace doesn't sell. War does. Well, judging from tonight, I would argue that actually peace still sells. Maybe it sells in UWC and not somewhere else. But jokes aside, let me first of all start to thank you very much for joining tonight. And I also want to thank UWC and Nick Alchin, head of college, and the team that has been supporting me. Thank you for inviting me to the Kishore Mahbubani Speaker Series. It's a great pleasure. Now, it is true that we as humans have a great fascination with war. War history, battle strategies, war heroes, even war stories are very fascinating. If I ask you a question, do you remember the last movie or TV series or maybe a book that you read which has war or a conflict in it? Have you recently watched anything that talks about war? Anyone? I did. All right. Can I ask you, have you watched recently a movie that talk about how to make peace? No hands, right? That's normal. If you watch a movie or read news, chances are it involves war. Maybe World War I or World War II. There are entire TV series about ancient battles, about civil wars, zombie wars, superhero wars. And don't even get me started with video games. And of course, news that always emphasize war over peace. And this is not accidental. Humans are deeply fascinated by war, much less about peace. And that raises an important question. And that is, why do we find war so interesting and peace so boring? Well, let me try to give you three quick reasons. First is that war is very dramatic. Peace is quiet. War makes for better stories. War has clear villains and heroes, high stakes, life and death situations. Peace, on the other hand, is quiet, is gradual. It's made of meetings, compromises, patience. Who wants to watch a movie about meetings? Here's an exception. Now, I worked with a Norwegian diplomat who was the architect of the famous Oslo Accords signed by Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1993. Now, some of you might remember this photo. Now, to get to this photo, the Palestinians and Israeli negotiators gathered in a secret in a villa outside Oslo, the capital of Norway. And my former boss was facilitating that process. He told me fascinating stories about that process, which, by the way, today are in a movie. So you can watch it on HBO, and then you tell me if peace is boring. Second reason is our brains are wired for threats. There is something biological going on here. For most of human history, survival depends on spotting danger. Our brains evolve to pay more attention to threats than to stability. A loud noise grabs your attention much more than silence. Bad news spreads much faster than good news. So war triggers that ancient alarm systems. Peace doesn't. And finally, war creates simple moral stories. In war stories, the world is often divided into us against them, good and evil, right and wrong, at least on the surface. Peace is much more complex. Peace requires talking to people that we don't like, making deals with former enemies, accepting compromises. So peace is full of gray zones, and we love simple stories. So for these reasons, we know that peace is difficult. It simmers, it doesn't catch our attention in the same way the war does. So of course, here there is a very big question, which is peace or is war the humanity natural conditions? Now, I don't have a definitive answer for you. However, if we dig deep into history, but not only in anthropology, in sociology, in archaeology, in psychology, in economic history, we can confidently say that humans have spent equal time in fighting as in building peace. There are traces of cooperation, of diplomacy throughout history, not just weapons. You're probably wondering what you're looking at. Well, you're looking at one of the oldest known diplomatic documents in history, dating back to approximately 2,500 before Common Era. It's the Treaty of Alliance with Uruk. It's a peace treaty between the two Sumerian city-states of Uruk and Lagash. That's the current south of Iraq. It is a clay nail used in the foundation of a temple. So we can say that peace is something the humans have invented, as they invented war. We have invented ideas, rules, and institutions that allowed us to live in peace. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to summarize for you the story of peace. And I'm going to do it guided by 3 questions. The first all is, what is peace? And how did the idea of peace change over time? Second, how did humans try to make peace? And finally, where are we now? And how might peace look like in the future? So, what is peace? And how did the idea of peace change over time? When we say the word peace, I guess most of you generally think of something quite universal. You think of a world without war, where people live safely and with dignity, with justice and opportunities. But for most of human history, peace meant something very different, something much narrower. In ancient history, peace did not mean equality or justice. It meant control. Peace was order, not harmony. And most likely, this order was brought by military victory, war. In ancient Rome, the famous Pax Romana, Roman peace, was made possible by soldiers, by roads built to move soldiers, and brutal punishment for rebellion. Some of you might have heard of the city of Carthage in today Tunisia. Carthage is best known for being razed to the ground by the Romans, and its lands covered with salt. Well, that probably didn't really happen. But we know for sure that the city was burned for 17 days, and the remaining 50,000 inhabitants were sold into slavery. And from that day, Rome dominated the Mediterranean Sea and created the condition for a peaceful life. It was a peace through dominance. It was what today we call negative peace. Basically, the absence of violence. It doesn't mean we're all happy and safe, but hey, better than war. We see a similar idea, by the way, in ancient China. During the Qing dynasty, in the 3rd century before Common Era, China was unified after centuries of war. And the emperor declared peace, but it was enforced through strict laws and harsh punishment. So for much of early history, peace belonged to the strong. As a famous Greek historian wrote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Thucydides wrote this sometime around 400 before Common Era in a book called History of the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between the 2 cities of Athens and Sparta. And by the way, Thucydides was not a professor, was a general. There's another general somewhere else in the world, Sun Tzu, who made similar arguments in China in The Art of War. This was written much earlier, the 5th century before Common Era. And he wrote about war, how it can be won, but also advocating for cooperation and diplomacy. So this entanglement between war and peace is very much a common pattern across civilizations. Of course, there were also people that were imagining peace very differently and wrote about peace as a moral choice. In ancient China, Confucius spoke not of peace as control, but as harmony. Harmony between ruler and people, between parents and children, between humans and nature. In ancient India, the idea of ahimsa, non-violence, emerged as a moral principle. Some scholars say even back to 3000 before Common Era. Centuries later, the emperor Ashoka would turn this idea into policy. After witnessing the horror of war due to his own conquest, Ashoka renounced violence, stopped military expansion, promoted religious tolerance, and invested in welfare. Most of these ideas of peace as a moral choice were captured in religion. Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam all include doctrines and rules about peace as a value. One challenge in those times, which by the way is also in more recent times, was that often religion was making war immoral or sinful when it was against their own people, not against other religions. Famously, Augustine was a philosopher of early Christian Christianity in Rome, in the Roman Africa, around 400 here. He wrote in a book called The City of God, the war within Christians was a sin, although outside Christian world, war might be needed. Jihad in Islam has a similar concept of struggles against the enemies of Islam. And I mention this because it allowed me to introduce a very important concept in peacemaking. Two ideas, bonding and bridging. Sorry, what is it? Bonding and bridging. Both are necessary for peace. But through history, most of the efforts were on bonding, not bridging. Bonding means to build solid relationship within our own communities, the people that look like us, behave like us. Bridging means to reach out to other communities and apply the same rules and morality to other groups. And to have peace, you cannot need both. Some of this thinking, as I said, capturing religions, also started to evolve in political and legal thinkers. So you have the famous Magna Carta, 1215, in England, which bound even the king to the law and introduced some basic ideas of human rights. But of course, these apply to England. Didn't really apply, let's say, to France. Again, bonding, not bridging. In my country of origin, Italy, the political writer Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, outlined the justification for immoral means to achieve high political goals by the rulers. The Dutch philosopher Erasmus from Rotterdam was imagining, in the same period, a peace that rejected war. He was part of this broader humanistic tradition that emerged in European Renaissance, which started to imagine ways to organize societies in a peaceful way without using war. But I also want to say that this was hardly an exclusive European pattern. In 1600 Japan, the former shogun and Confucian scholar, Tokugawa Ieyasu, promoted over 250 years of stability and relative peace, creating rules to control the role of the other shogun. The shogun was a military leader. It has been actually called the Pax Tokugawa, the Tokugawa peace, very similar to the Roman peace that I mentioned before, enforced by strict social structures and also isolation from the outside world. So peace becomes more than just military victory, it becomes an ethical choice. It's a decision, mainly by strong leaders, but it's still a decision. Now let me jump ahead, and while the Tokugawa peace was happening in Japan, in Europe, after 30 years of brutal religious war, European leaders finally sat down to negotiate, and they signed in 1648 the Peace of Westphalia. What mattered was not just that the war ended, but how. Peace became something written down. Borders were recognized, rules were agreed upon, and state promised not to interfere in each other's internal affairs. It was basically the birth of sovereign states. Peace was becoming a political system. This idea that peace depends on rules, sovereignty, diplomacy, still shapes our thinking of peace today. Much, of course, happened in 17 and 1800 when this idea of peace as a political system started to develop, again in philosophers and in thinkers. John Locke from England, Immanuel Kant from Germany, Imam Shamil from Dagestan, Russia, Raja Ram Mohan Roy from India, Wei Yuan from China, all wrote about this idea of law-based government and even sometimes global order that can lead to domestic and international peace. And I apologize, there are many more names. But I wanted to give you a flavor that the idea of peace has been very much a struggle across civilization, not just one. To me, this means that this need for peaceful coexistence is very much part of our human heritage. But it is only in the 20th century that the idea of peace as a shared responsibility became central to our idea of peace. After 2 world wars, the Holocaust, 2 atomic bombs, war seems not so heroic any longer. So that political system of balance of power and alliances that was built in Europe in 19th century clearly did not guarantee peace. I would also argue that the threat of a nuclear war had much to do with this shifting in how humanity started to think about war. And so after 1945, humanity tried again to reinvent peace. This time, peace was no longer seen as something that countries could secure alone. The United Nations was created. Human rights were declared universal. Peacekeeping missions were launched. The message was new. Peace anywhere depends on peace everywhere. Now, you understand that this kind of peace becomes much more complex. Peace becomes linked to democracy. This is the idea of democratic peace, which tells us that democracies don't go to war with each other, at least so far. Peace became linked to economic development, social integration, human security, minority rights, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and so on. It became what today we call positive peace. A peace treaty is good, but not good enough. Peace requires also rights for identity, equality, justice, reconciliation, as well as security and development. Of course, you understand that this idea of peace is a tall order, a much harder achievement, a much more sophisticated approach to peacemaking. So the idea of peace has evolved through human history. And as the idea of peace evolved, also the way we made peace changed. And this is my second theme that I would like to address. How did humans try to make peace? Now, we learn through my short story of peace that peace can be achieved through military victory, through war, or the threat of war. I call it the victory peace. This still happens today. The 26-year Sri Lanka conflict ended in 2009 with a military defeat of the Liberation Tigers, the LTTE, who fought for an independent Tamil state in the north and east of the country. Another example could be the end of the civil war in Syria that culminated in the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024. So the first way to make peace is to wage war. But today, this is rare. Most conflict in the past 50 years or so did not end through a military victory, but they ended through a negotiation process. Cambodia, Vietnam in 1991, Bosnia, El Salvador, Mozambique in 92, Guatemala in 96, Northern Ireland in 98, Mindanao in the Philippines in 2014, Colombia in 2015. These are just to name a few. These are all examples of what I call constitutional peace. Peace agreements based on laws and rules that aim to reset relationship and build a legal framework for reconciliation and peaceful coexistence. Now, I did some work in Liberia after the civil war ended, and the UN peace effort that included a framework to bring back economic development, again, positive peace. One challenge was to restart the rubber plantations in the country. Because, you see, during the war, rubber trees were illegally tapped, and then they die. So you need a big investment from companies to come back to the country, replant the trees, and restart the business to allow for people to live in peace. If people have good jobs, they will have less reasons to fight. So this is a very complex peace. There is a third way to make peace, and that is the institutional peace. This is a more ambitious way of making peace. It is a way to anchor states within a specific set of values and legal norms to create a more stable order, sometimes a global order. And that is the role of the United Nations. Other global institutions, not part of the United Nations, have similar goals. For example, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, which gave rise to international humanitarian law, or the International Criminal Court to persecute individuals for war crimes. These are all international mechanisms for peace. Finally, a fourth way to make peace is what I call the civil peace. Every individual in society has the capacity to mobilize and promote peace from different perspectives. Since the beginning of the 20th century, particularly when World War I broke out, we saw a growing role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, active in different areas, from disarmament to human rights, from non-violence to refugees, from women's rights to gender equality. It is here that we witness a strong role of women emerging in peace activism. In 1915, the very famous International Congress of Women in The Hague saw over 1,000 delegates establishing the International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace. It was led by an American activist, Jane Addams, who, by the way, became the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, but not the first woman, because the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize was the Austrian Baroness, Bertha von Sattern, in 1905. Was a leader of the international peace movement, also known for writing a great novel, anti-war novel, Lay Down Your Arms. So if you're looking for a reading on peace instead of war, that's a good one. Since then, 20 women won the Nobel Peace Prize, contributing not only to activism, but also to the idea of peace. But civil peace can also be very local. I mean, all these people had global impact, local and global. But a lot of local actors have been crucial to build peace. Some had massive intellectual and political influence at global level. I'm just mentioning Gandhi with his Satyagraha, a philosophy of non-violence resistance. Others have mechanisms that remain very local but are equally important. In Timor-Leste, for example, after independence in 2002, sacred houses, the Huma Lulik, came back as a center of social life where celebration takes place, but also serves as a space for dispute resolution. The example of civil peace are too many to mention, from land conflict resolution in Uganda, to Afghan women groups negotiating with the Taliban, to Israeli-Palestinian youth camps. So, in summary, peace is made in 4 ways: through war, through peace agreements, through institutions, and through civil society and individuals for advocacy and conflict resolution. Of course, all this plays at multiple levels. You have international, you have regional, you have state level, you have community, individual levels. These levels also interact with each other. Let me give you just a couple of quick examples from my personal experience. I worked in Cyprus in 2002, where I experienced all these levels happening at the same time. Women group reaching across divide between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. That's the community level. Official negotiations between the leaders of the 2 governments. That was the state level. The role of the European Union, which tried to create incentive to unify the country before granting access of Cyprus to the European Union. That was the regional level. It didn't work, by the way. An international level, with the UN sponsoring peace process. Maybe a more successful example is Northern Ireland. I had the luck and fortune to have long conversations with Senator George Mitchell when we were both working at Columbia University in New York. And Senator Mitchell was a US negotiator who facilitated the famous Good Friday Agreement in 1998, a landmark peace accord in Northern Ireland that ended decades of sectarian conflict. Now, Senator Mitchell told me that all these levels were working and they were necessary. Of course, there was an international level. It was himself, he was American, but he was just mediating. But there was also a regional level with economic incentive from the European Union. And of course, there was a state level because the actual agreement was signed by states, right? The UK and Ireland. And also a lot of social activism, many civil society individuals and organizations involved in a more micro level peacemaking to reconcile communities. So all these factors play with each other and are very important. Where are we today? And how might peace look like in the future? Now, I am a member of a research committee of the Institute for Economics and Peace. This is a think tank that is based in Sydney, which has been producing for the past 20 years a global peace index. So here what we can read from the last report, 2025. There are currently 59 active conflicts, the most since the end of World War II, and 3 more than last year. The successful resolution of conflict is lower than at any point in the last 50 years. Conflict that ended in a decisive victory fell from 49% in the 70s to 9% in 2010, while conflict that ended through peace agreements fell from 23% to 4% over the same period. And although the level of positive peace improved for over a decade, up to 2019, they've since been in decline, including in both North America and Europe. So I guess the answer to the first question, where are we now, is not in a good place. The peace trend is not positive. Now, certainly in 2025, we have seen the end of a few conflicts, more notably the war in Gaza, the peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the end of hostilities between India and Pakistan, between Cambodia and Thailand, are all welcome. However, peace is not there. Violence can erupt again in any time. Has it already happened, by the way, in Thai-Cambodia conflict or in the Rwanda-Congo conflict? These 2 countries signed a peace agreement in December, but by the end of the year, the fight already started. So unfortunately, in the past year, the global architecture for peace has been undermined. Now, don't get me wrong. The system is not perfect. It is weak. It has no enforcement. It relies on agreements among big powers. And it is unfair toward other countries. So I'm not saying that the UN-based system is perfect. It's not. But undermine it doesn't have to fix it. It needs important changes in the direction of more inclusivity, more enforcement, and more agile decision-making. But it doesn't require destruction. And this is even more important as we all face challenges that are beyond state borders. Climate change, new technological weapons, artificial intelligence don't have passports. They create challenges that cut across borders and require cooperation to be solved. But realistically, I think that in the next few years, cooperation in peace will be very hard. It will not be dead, but will be less common. Probably we will see models of peace that I call hybrid. This hybrid peace means that the use of military force or the threat of military force and coercion will be used to kind of fix problems. Peace negotiation will be more localized, less international role, and more local and civil society activism, which might bring to very different agreements across the world, depending on where you are. Powerful countries will try to influence their own sphere of influence, both as war actors and as peacemakers. Countries like UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Turkey, Kenya, just to name a few, will continue to facilitate peace processes, but they might also intervene militarily where match their national interest. And peace will take different forms. Sometimes the form of negative peace, like in Gaza today. Sometimes the form of a more complex peace, not a fully positive peace, but certainly more robust, like in Colombia, for example. Now, not all of this is negative, but it is more fragmented, less coordinated, and probably not always very effective. So in summary, I talked about 4 ideas of peace. Peace as order, peace as a moral and ethical choice, peace as political system, and peace as shared responsibilities. It evolved through human history. I talk about 4 ways of making peace. I call it victory peace, constitutional peace, institutional peace, and civil peace. They can exist all at the same time. And finally, I talk about peace going forward, hybrid peace, and the coexistence of both negative and positive peace. Now, the key to build peace is actually to build positive peace. This hasn't changed. A positive peace is the attitude, the institution, and the structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. A positive peace is also very strongly correlated statistically with higher GDP growth, lower interest rate, social well-being, and more resilience to shocks. So the tools might be changing, but the aim remains the same: building positive peace. It is imperfect, it is sometimes frustrating, it often fails, it's always hard work, but it's also the only way that we know to guarantee prosperity and well-being of humanity. It is worth fighting for it. It is worth contributing to the humanity journey of peace that I just described. Thank you. All right. Who's starting?
Hi. Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Professor Francesco, for this amazing insight that make us shape our perspective about peace that we already have, and make us think about new questions. That's why I want to start saying that when we talk about peace, we often think of the end of something, the end of a war, a conflict, or the end of violence. But in different contexts, like System Transformation Project, my Spanish class, or even in global politics, I have the conclusion I have come to the conclusion that peace is not an end. Peace is something that is built, negotiated, and sustained every day. So throughout thousands of years, right, societies have imagined peace in different ways. But today, in a world marked by climate crisis, technology, and global challenges, that idea is being transformed once again, right? Sorry. After this exploration of peace in different times and contexts that you were talking about, we now open this space for dialogue to develop some of the ideas that Professor Mancini has just shared with us. So I'm going to start by asking you, if you allow me, if we think about, if we think of a conflict or the absence of peace, not as a problem, but as a result of a system that isn't working, what do you think is the area that we should focus on to avoid this outcome?
All right, thank you. Well, so first of all, I completely agree with what you said. I think we've seen through human history that peace is a process. Right? So peace is a thing, and sometimes take the form of a thing. It's an agreement, it's something we sign, right? And I would argue that that's kind of necessary. I mean, you need that formalization of a moment. I mean, if you think for a moment, all countries, well, almost all countries, have constitutions, almost all. This is a sort of a social contract, right, between people in that country and the people who are in charge of ruling that country. And it's little like the rule of the game, right? You buy your board game, and this is the rule of the game. A peace agreement is similar. You set up new rules because exactly the system, as you said, doesn't work. It's actually creating tensions and conflict, right? So I would say that's a necessary step. But that piece of paper does not guarantee that you actually have peace. We have seen many peace agreements signed and then eventually collapsed. I think South Sudan is an interesting case where there was a peace agreement, there is a long process, and within 2 years after the signing, they were back fighting. Why? Well, because peace is not just about what you sign, but it's actually changing attitude and behaviors. And that takes time. Again, I go back to the example of South Sudan. Those who were then charged to run the government were actually been fighting with each other for 30 years. Do you think that you just put them in an office? I take the second floor, you take the third floor, and we run a country? Of course not, right? Within 2 years, they're fighting again. So you have to create the right incentives, right, to actually make people to work together, which goes back to that concept of bonding and bridging. And I think countries know that instinctively, and a lot of countries put a lot of policy into that. And since we're sitting in Singapore, I think Singapore is a kind of a perfect example, right? There is a lot of bonding in the sense that you have your own heritage and you want to cultivate it, right? You can learn your own language, you connect with the people, right? But that's not enough to create a society. You want to bridge, right? You want to connect with the others, right? And so creating incentive for both becomes quite important. And there is no perfect recipe, right? Every country takes it in a different way.
Thank you very much. Now we have some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm Sumedha. And so recently in my Global Politics class, I wrote this paper on negative peace and positive peace,
Okay.
which was so inspiring to hear you talk as well. And there, I think the question was, is the only definition of peace the absence of violence? And that's what we had to argue in that paper. So some of my arguments were taking the example of El Salvador, where just negative peace, which was the removal of these gangs, which is the absence of their violence, has resulted in positive peace in some cases, obviously with the very strict regime of the head of government there as well. So my question to you is, do you think there are like certain conflicts or examples in this world where sometimes negative peace is just enough? Like sometimes negative peace is the only thing that is capable to not even maybe go towards positive peace, but that is probably the only possible solution.
Sure. No, absolutely. Thanks for that. So first of all, negative, positive peace. Professors love definitions, but I never met anyone that actually talk like that. You know, you are in a peace negotiation process and you never see someone say, like, let me think about negative peace today. No. This terminology actually has been created by a famous scholar, a Norwegian scholar, Galtung, who in the end of the 60s, he created these two categories, right? I think they're very helpful because they help us to kind of understand that you have a step in which, of course, you stop violence, right? And that's good. And I think what is tricky of this definition is that negative make you think that is bad. No. Negative peace is great. They've been shooting at me for 30 years. They stop. That's great, right? So absolutely negative peace, and sometimes negative peace is the target. Sometimes situations are deteriorated so much that you're actually negotiating a ceasefire. You're not really negotiating peace. Yeah, that's good enough. If you follow, recent conflicts, for example, in Gaza, that was very much the conversation at some point, right? Okay, let's stop the violence. We'll do certain things during this period, and let's not talk about peace, right? And not even mention positive peace. Right? So, absolutely, pragmatism is there in every peace negotiation. My argument is that with negative peace, you always live in the risk to fall back. Negative peace tend to be quite fragile. As long as you have the incentives there to keep it as it is, nobody moves. But as soon as someone does something, then you go back to violence very easily, right? Positive peace allows you to create structures that makes maybe much more unlikely, right? So today you could argue that, for example, the European Union has created a little bit of debt. I mean, look at the history of Germany and France. These are two countries and two people that basically kind of kill each other for 10 centuries. Now it's kind of unlikely, right? I mean, we're not really thinking about that scenario. This has been very much made, okay, at the end of the war, the Second World War, etc., but through different mechanisms, different incentives, right? So that's the goal, right? We can make ASEAN example as well, right? This is a part of the world that also experienced a lot of conflict, right? But to be frank, I mean, today thinking that some country is going to attack others is kind of unlikely, right? So that's the goal. The goal is to create permanent structures, laws, attitudes that will make more unlikely the use of violence.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I think those examples really motivate you to actually be positive, have a optimistic outlook about peace building.
Thank you. So I wanted to share also, last summer, a group of students from both Dover and East traveled to Timor-Leste. I was among them, okay, to facilitate a peace conference in Timor-Leste. And I think particularly in a school like UwC, where a lot of people try to make their small contribution to peace in the world, I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you believe it is our responsibility as individuals to hold governments and power structures accountable for ensuring peaceful practices in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a citizen of a country, I think you have that responsibility. I mentioned constitutions. That constitution is a kind of a social contract. So if you sign that contract, right, of course you didn't decide to be born in that place, but you are there. You have a responsibility as a member of a society. But I would argue, this of course, it depends on how you feel about it, but I would argue that you also have a responsibility as a human being beyond the borders of wherever happened that you are, to support and foster that kind of thinking, right? My experience professionally is that there is no way to bring peace to a place that doesn't want peace. Peace comes from within. So, this idea that, the UN goes there, they negotiate, no. Unless there are conditions, there's actually a terminology, it's called ripeness, like a banana. Conflict can be ripe for resolution. You can create incentives, right? Of course you can come there and create incentives. That was my example of regional levels, international levels. Yes, I come with, for example, a bucket of money, and I say, I'm going to help you in development, but you make peace, right? So you can create incentive, but the reality is that unless the preconditions are right, you cannot bring peace from outside. It comes from within, right? Not an argument to not go to Timor-Leste and help, right? Of course, I think that's great. That's fundamental, right? So I think we all have a role, but I would also put a note of caution there, right? That a lot of these mechanisms are very indigenous, they're very local, right? And we can help, but that's what we can do, we can help.
Thank you, that was really insightful.
Right, so I wanted to ask about the bonding and bridging thing that you talked about earlier, because it's very interesting. At the end, you said the future of peace is likely to be very localized. And so bonding and bridging within communities is likely to be one of the ways that that kind of happens, because conflicts within a place are likely to come from those kinds of things. At UWC, we're obviously very pro-bridging. Like, our entire goal is to break down the boundaries that are set up between countries and unite for a more peaceful future. But we see right now, with the rise of things like anti-immigration rhetoric across the world, that this outlook towards bridging, this love of bridging that has been promoted by international institutions and such for a long time, has kind of led to a backlash where people now want to become more tribalist or dislike other groups. So in these kinds of situations where there is backlash over tolerance has been tried and maybe it hasn't worked, is there possible for local peace in this regard?
Yeah, thank you for the easy question.
You're welcome. I try.
Yeah. No, so the bonding and bridging are two fundamental concepts in peace building, right? In the fear of peace building. Again, nobody really used that language on the ground when you go and say, oh, you're doing bonding, you're bridging. No, but it's a way to organize your thinking, right? And of course you want to create identity, right? You want to create sense of belonging. If you look at the history, not just of peace, but the history of states, that has been the challenge of building states. You take the German land. In the German land, until 150 years ago, there were tens of countries. Then eventually only 2, and now 1. That required a lot of work, right? But nobody today would think that someone in Bavaria would start to attack someone in Hamburg. But that's sense of belonging, right, to a community need to be built. And so that's state building. We actually call it, there is a full science on it, which is actually state building. But because societies today becomes more diverse, and they have all diverse, well, because we talk about technology, we talk about mobility, you're not going to stop there. Well, people keep moving around. They move around through history, and they will continue to move around. Then the bridging becomes a fundamental element, right? Because societies are less homogeneous, and you need to create ways to allow for that peaceful coexistence. And my argument is, I think a lot of countries fail in that. Sometimes they fail out of attention to that, not because there was a bad intention, right? It just they didn't think about it, right? And so that effort to actually help people to connect with diversity, broadly speaking, right? And it just wasn't there. And so all of a sudden you wake up and your neighborhood and your look completely different, right? And that might create reactions, right? And I think that is happening in a lot of places, where people is like, oh, what is going on here? I don't recognize myself in this place any longer, and so on and so forth. And then these, of course, can degenerate into violence. Doesn't have to degenerate into violence, right? It can just be discrimination or other things, right? In some cases, might degenerate, of course, in violence. And so, to me, today, if I were a policymaker, right, I would be really put a lot of effort on that bridging part, right? I think a lot of countries are doing quite okay in the bonding part. There is a strong identity and is already there. But there's capacity to understand that today, again, societies are much more diverse. Right? And it's not an easy task, right? Particularly if you haven't done it for a while, and catch up with that, right? So a huge challenge to me is really one of the key challenges to peaceful coexistence today. And you might argue that actually most of the violence today happen within countries rather than between countries. Of course, there are exceptions, right? But a lot of the violence and conflict that people experience, it comes within their own country. And so we call it interstate violence, right? It's different than violence between countries. It requires different techniques and different ways of doing it. So I think you are on a very important issue.
Okay, thank you. I think it was really interesting. We have time, right? it was really interesting that you answered to Ivan's question about that it's not possible to make peace in a place that don't want peace, right? But the thing that you can incentivize peace. It was interesting because we are in a school that born from this aim to create peace, like putting people from different countries in order to share cultures, and then from that make peace. And that's why I want to ask you, what is the main peace that are we looking for?
The main peace?
The main peace, like, because you talk about different kind of peace,
yeah.
And today in the actual context, taking in account all that is happening, what do you think is the peace that we are looking for?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, and actually allow me to say also another things that has changed dramatically, let's say, since the 90s. So first of all, just very directly, there is no one peace model. And maybe, this is one of the challenges that we had coming out of 1990s, which was a particular moment in history, a very interesting 10 years, where due to geopolitical situations, the United Nations became extremely active in peace building and state building. But the challenge is that they basically had one model in mind. And that was, whatever you want to call it, sort of liberal democracy model, where you need multi-party elections, you need free press, you need certain rights, and so on and so forth, right? And it was a very template kind of approach that would have to work in Sierra Leone, you have to work in Timor-Leste, you have to work in Croatia. And I think that was problematic. And not because I disagree on any of these things that I just said, but because, as I said, peace is a very local process. And in thinking that the Sierra Leoneans would actually think about the way they're going to live together in the same way that a Timorese does, it just doesn't make sense, right? And so, of course, today this is gone. This broader project of a sort of liberal democracy peace is gone. And that, because I always try to find something positive to think about, maybe it's not that bad. And what I mean by that is, because of more localized peace, maybe you give space to societies and communities to come up with their own model, right? For peaceful coexistence. Right? And by the way, they are educated, they can read, they can find models. I don't have to come myself to tell them, right? They can see that there are different models. But what I'm saying is, in the past, these models were imposed. And talking about incentives, they were also connected with particular financial incentives. And so, of course, even if you were not very convinced that that was the best way to go, you would still have very good incentive to do it. Because that meant, to be very concrete, that IMF, World Bank would come with money and just help you in different fronts, right? So that created a bit of a perversive kind of incentive there to do certain things that I know, and I met a lot of these local leaders that were not fully convinced that this was going to work, right? So that's what I meant. You can bring it from outside, you can facilitate. Of course, financial incentives are important, shouldn't be discredited. But creating more space for locals to come up with their own model, I think is not such a bad thing at the end of the day. Which of course means that the global order is going to be very different, right? That has different implications. But again, trying to find something positive in today's trends.
Yeah, as you say, we are always trying to find something positive. I think it's a good point to let the communities to find a way to find peace, right? Because sometimes we try to solve problems, as I said, and maybe the system is not working at that point, so maybe the communities have the power to solve that. Guys, you have any other questions?
Thank you very much to our panel and to the professor. We're going to hand over to the audience now for some Q&A for about 25 minutes. So if anybody has a question, we'll try and prioritise student questions. but we will get to as many of you as possible. I'm going to start with this young lady down the front here.
Thank you. So I'm Elena from Dover campus, and I'm first of all, really thank you for your insightful and inspiring speech. So in the speech, you mentioned that sometimes peace is like highly relevant to the existence and maintenance of peace is highly relevant to local communities. So as part of the community and the society, I wonder for like students aspiring to like pursue careers in international peace and security beyond like theoretical knowledges, what one or two core like competence or like mental habits you like consider like most critical?
Okay, thank you. Should I answer right away? Yeah. Great, thank you for the question. I would say two buckets of skills, right? One is actually quite a deep knowledge of the country and the culture in which you operate. Let's call it the political economy of a country. Understanding how societies work there, right? So that is important. It's not just speaking the language. Huh? It's actually really understanding those dynamics. But there's also another bucket, which is, we in academia we call it soft skills, but I think it's very unfair, because I don't think they're soft at all. One is empathy. It is your capacity to put yourself in the shoes of someone else. It is your capacity to understand the point of view of others. And you see, in conflict resolution, this is very important, because sometimes you sit at the table with groups that have done very naughty things. And you certainly disagree with that. You don't agree with people blown up in an hospital or a school or whatever. However, I would argue, you still need to have those skills to be able to connect and try to understand why they did that, right? What is the reason that doing that violence, this group thought that they could achieve a particular goal? Because you see, maybe if I find that reason, maybe I can help them to reach that goal without a violent means. But for that, you need that level of connection, right? That allowed you to kind of understand the why behind it. Right? And that's a skill to cultivate. So these are my two things.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Mancini, for being here answering our questions. I'm Gabi. I'm from Ecuador, and I am a grade 11 student from East. And as we learned in the system transformation class system, the concept, I believe that peace is a system. It involves many things, as you said. And also, I believe that the non-profit organizations, the NGOs, really create an impact. I have been part since 5 years ago in that type of organizations, children's and women's rights organizations. So, I want to ask, how do you think that peace can be really applied in power structures, specifically how peace can be applied in the government in order to really create an impact, not superficially? And how important you think to the government is to open the doors to listen to the no-profit organizations in order to create peace? Thank you for your answer.
Thank you for the question. I agree with you. I mean, civil society is very important and has played historically a very important role, even before it was called civil society. Okay, so the civil society idea is quite recent, but has played a role throughout history. Listen, again, this might be controversial, but most governments in the world, they actually want peace. I know that today we read that, people in power are only interested in buying weapons and starting wars and so on and so forth. I mean, my experience, not really. There are exceptions, of course. But the vast majority of governments around the world want peace, because peace is a guarantee of economic success, of being able to stay there for longer. It's a much safer bet. And you can still make your money through peace. You don't need war. It's a very costly way of making money, by the way. It's a very inefficient way. So the vast majority of governments actually, they want peace, and they won't create situation of stability. Now, of course, there are very often dynamics in different countries around the world, right? The dynamics within societies and powers that can create conflicts, right? And you mentioned from Ecuador. Of course, you come from a part of the world where you had a lot of that between different identities, between different groups, and so on and so forth. And sometimes the warring parties were the government, right? Fighting some part of their own people, right? So yes, of course, this happens, but I would argue that this is actually quite an exception. But I think you pointed out it's the people. At the end of the day, it comes down to the people. A country close to yours, Colombia, the FARC fought for what, 40 years? They did terrible things. The government did terrible things as well. And at some point, they kind of decided that didn't make any sense, right? That's what I meant by we come from within. Of course, there were the Norwegian helping. They went to Cuba to negotiate. Yes, you can help, no problem, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it was a decision that came from within the people. And as you know, from some of you have been following, that first peace agreement was actually rejected in a referendum locally. Right? There were some elements that were very controversial. But, so what I'm saying is, it's a local negotiation. There's not much that Norwegians could do. So come from within, come from civil society, and come from this relationship between those in government, those in position of powers, and civil society. At the end of the day, you need those in power to pick up those pieces of conversation that are civil society, otherwise they never become system.
We have a question here. Sorry, I'll just go to this lady.
Oh, okay. Hello, I'm from India. I'm actually doing my postdoc currently in NUS, and I'm actually an LKY alumni. And thank you so much for the talk. It was really engaging and insightful. My question was about the Board of Peace, and any thoughts you can share about it publicly.
Sorry,
the Board of Peace, which has just been established by...
The Board of Peace, sure.
Sorry, it's a bit controversial.
Yeah, it's all right. No, it's not. No,
anything you can publicly share your views, and also in the, I think, changing global order and just increasing times of polarization, what role, if any, it would play. Thank you.
No, thanks for the question. Well, first of all, I have to say, I don't know much about it. I mean, I know what you all read, so I don't have any insights in it. And whatever is out there, it's actually not so clear. Originally, it looked like it was something about Gaza, but now it looks like it's something about the globe. So it's a bit unclear exactly what the focus is. I would argue that probably the starting point is Gaza, actually, but there are probably some ambitions to operate at the more global level. What can I say? It's an interesting model. I've never seen it before. The fact that you have to pay a fee to be a member, $2 billion, by the way, which is not a joke. Most countries don't pay that for the United Nations. But you have to pay a fee in 3 years. And if you do the math, you understand why 3 years. So for now, it's free. But in 3 years, you have to pay $2 billion if you want to be a member of it. It's an interesting concept, and I would argue it goes in the direction of privatization of peace. So this idea that, which is, by the way, it's not unique, that economics drive peace. Again, not unique. A lot of people know, and of course there are connection between that. What kind of economics, that's maybe we can discuss. But it's too early to see what these things is about. Because to be honest, they haven't done nothing so far. So if the idea is to substitute the Security Council, I would argue the Security Council is much more effective. But so far, they haven't done anything. So I would say let's meet again in a year and see what they achieved.
First of all, thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. So my question as a student that in the future wants to change a little bit this system, so how do we, if we want to change this global system from the inside, where do we start? What is the leverage point? Like, I mean, we have treaties, we have laws that like are global laws, but we don't really, we see them work sometimes, but not always. And so how can we actually like tilt the system? Where do we start? What is the actual one of the leverage points, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It's a very difficult question. I guess the first decision you want to make is what system we are talking about, right? The systems are at many levels, right? You can also make very substantive and important change at a very local level. You don't have to change the world, but you can change your neighborhood, right? So I think the first step is, okay, what is that level, right, that I want to have an impact. If you are talking about system as the United Nations, for example, well, that's a tough call. But, I mean, I'm not going to bore you with the history of the reform of the United Nations, but my argument is the United Nations is an incredibly resilient organization. It has survived through so many political systems. Pre-Cold War, Cold War, post-Cold War, hyperpower of the United Nations, the whatever mess we are right now that I don't know how to call it, the UN is still there. The previous attempt at the League of Nations didn't go so well. So I would argue that actually the UN has a very strong resilience and has gone through multiple cycles of reforms. So reform is possible. Of course, there are certain key elements that are very hard to change. If I were now, had the enthusiasm to say, okay, let's go to New York or Geneva and just try to change things, frankly, I think that the issue of, one, inclusivity is very important, right? So who take the decisions of what? It's very important. And the second is enforcement. We need to accept that. We need to create some mechanism. If you sign something, so you say something, and you don't do it, then something happens. And that's, I think, is a key problem. It's a problem of international law, of course. But to me, it's a key element. Because otherwise, we all sign everything, and then when we want to disagree, we disagree, and nothing happens. Right? That has created a lot of imbalances and unfairness and resentment. But it's not a reason to say that the system doesn't work. I mean, to some extent, it works.
Thank you, Professor, and that was an excellent presentation. It put things into a kind of perspective and a structure to how we think about this. I pick on two of your points, which you have made, in passing maybe, is that one is that democracies generally don't go to war, and the second is on the bonding and bridging. My ask of you is to think about 3 or 4 instances that we have seen today in the current environment, and you mentioned probably all 3 of them, where actually these are democracies who have gone to war, and it's, in a sense, they've chosen to be warlike. I could mention them, the 3 of them which come to mind immediately. And it seems to me that the democratic process of bonding within the countries has actually led to them, in a sense, the leaders who should have, according to you, don't want war, they're leaders of democratic countries, but they're looking at the bonding within in their countries and exporting that, not exporting bonding and bridging, and using that as a pressure point to actually go out and do war. And I'll give you the examples. One is, of course, Israel, which has, in itself is a democracy, but has so many of the right-wing people who are basically controlling how the war in Gaza was persecuted. The second is India, which is my country. The push towards the conflict with Pakistan is because the government wants to show to a certain constituency within the country, from an electoral perspective, many times, that they're doing something which is good and brave. And the third, which is right now the talk of everything, is the US. The way that the MAGA piece has actually gone on to the global stage with what's happening is, in a sense, you could say it's a process of democracy which has led it to happen. So what do you think about that this is a conflict in itself which is leading this to happen?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So first of all, let me clarify that the democratic peace idea, it doesn't say that democracies don't go to war. It says democracies don't go to war with each other, which is a bit different. So yes, democracy do start wars, and you make examples, right? So we don't have to remember them. We know. But what doesn't necessarily happen so far is that two democracies don't go to war. What is behind this theory? A famous New York Times journalist, Thomas Friedman, years ago created the McDonald Index. And he basically created the McDonald peace theory. Because he noticed that no countries that had McDonald's would go to war with each other. Okay, that's interesting. The theory collapsed when NATO bombed Belgrade. But let's put it aside. What was behind that theory? The theory is that as countries become wealthier, so you develop a larger middle class, which is generally when McDonald's come to your country, by the way. When you start to have a larger middle class, then people shift incentives. They have less interest to fund or to go to war, and they have more interest in peace, stability, growth, and so on and so forth. So there is an economic theory behind that, right? But of course, people's choices can be also manipulated, right, in a way. But also, you mentioned some of those examples. People react to events. And so we can argue that a lot of democracies decided to go to war after a shock. Right? That created, we call it casus belli, a reason to go to war, which was easier to sell. Because actually it's not easy to sell to a wealthy country, stable countries, we should all go to war. Right? So that's where the theory comes from. And I would argue that big shocks change that calculation. And when you get an attack or you get a particular trauma, then you have more propensity, right, to actually go to war. And that has nothing to do of how your system, internal system is governed. Your democracy or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You still have that mechanism. So we know that today that democracy is not a guarantee for peace. And so I think that has, of course, important consequences, right, on how we think. And if I were an economist, probably I would actually tell you that actually economics is more important than politics. There's a big debate out there between economics and political scientists. It's called the greed versus grievance debate. Right? And every economist, I'm generalizing. Most economists will tell you it's all about greed. People go to war because of interest, right? But political science, most likely, will tell you it's about grievances. It's about because you are upset for something or because a right has been violated, right? So this is a huge debate out there about this.
Hello,
I wanted to ask, because you've emphasized the importance of popular participation in peace building, which seems to align with ideas of popular sovereignty, overall like the nation's participation when it comes to building peace. My question is addressing deeply divided post-conflict societies such as Kosovo, where you have identity politics between the Albanian and the Serb population that remains strong, and how can we expect populations with incomplete or distorted information to make decisions that lead to long-term peace rather than reinforce ethno-national divisions?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, so it's an easy way to do politics, to build your argument around identities that are easily identifiable, right? It's your race, your religion, etc. These are easy. And so I would argue that actually it's a relatively popular way to do politics and to gain your vote. It's an easy way to do it, right? But that can actually tear apart a country because it actually builds your identity around your own community, not across, right? And I don't know if you come from that part of the world, but of course that part of the world has experience, right? So that kind of full collapse of that. When there was some kind of ideology that kept the thing together, and then when that collapsed, the former Yugoslavia, all those more nationalistic identities came out, right? And because it's part of the world where people live everywhere, there is no perfect matching, right, between your identity, your religion, your country, and so on, right? It's the history of the Balkans. Then it's very easy for a politician to build on that and say, you know, I get your vote because I'm supporting that particular. That's a very dangerous thing to do. And I think we can go around the world and see this as a reason of war, mainly civil wars, sometimes also across, but civil wars. Africa is also a very good case, where using sort of ethnic or clans, sometimes not just ethnic, it's clans, think about Somalia, identities that tears a country apart. Today, Somalia is an expression on the map. It's not a country. It's many countries. So I think it's very dangerous, and as people who care about peace, we should do everything possible to overcome that kind of argument, right? And try to build identities around other things.
Firstly, thank you for your speech. It was very interesting. So I actually do MUN, and one thing I've noticed is that one's ideal solution might oppose another's ideal solution. So I was wondering, is there ever going to be such thing as true peace? Will we ever be in a situation where everyone's in harmony?
Oh, that would be nice. But also a bit boring, right? I mean, imagine if we all agree on everything. No, I'm kidding. I mean, no, I'm not a believer in this global harmony and peace. It's actually quite funny because also if you look at you know, the fiction, the science fiction production, right? We all imagine these worlds in which we are all kind of dressed the same, and we all kind of, I think about Star Trek, right? They all wear kind of pajamas, they're all kind of the same. But what do they do all day long? They all kill each other, right? They all go to war with each other, right? They don't use money anymore, they're super evolved. But actually war is still there. So it seems that war is really something that we cannot get rid of it, right? So agreements on everything is impossible. We're always going to have degrees of agreements. And that's the work of peace building. The work of peace building is actually finding the right incentives and creating the right channels, right, to create those moments of agreements. And through history, you got it. I mean, humanity's built incredible agreements around things that you were like, I've never thought about that. I mean, when in 2002 they created the International Criminal Court, you had more than 100 countries, they willingly said, yeah, you want to arrest me? Sure, no problem. I mean, that is crazy, right? So what I'm saying is that there are moments in history where we really kind of agree on things that are really quite impressive, I have to say. But it's a lot of work. If you meet the people who work to get to the Rome Treaty or the International Criminal Court, that's a hell of a lot of work. It's a long journey, very difficult, very complicated. So the bottom line is peace is a hard work. It doesn't come for free.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for your insightful observation about negative and positive peace. So today I was talking with my teacher in global politics. We were talking about the importance of trust as a basis for peace. And a question came to mind. In conflicts like Ukraine or Gaza, why is a ceasefire considered only negative peace if the two sides still do not trust each other? And how does building trust in rules and systems help create a real positive peace? Thank you.
Thank you. That requires another lecture. Generally ceasefires are considered in the category of negative peace, right? Because ceasefire is just an attempt to stop violence with the goal of doing something, humanitarian relief or release of prisoners or whatever, right? So you have some kind of short-term goal. And sometimes that's all you can do. So very often negotiators go for that because it's just simply too hard to aim to a full peace treaty, right? And I say, I take it. I take the ceasefire. The ceasefires come with problems, of course, because ceasefires are also used to rearm and reorganize yourself. So a lot of countries don't like ceasefires because they fear that the other side is not in good faith. And the other side is just using that moment, the window of peace, to just rearm, re-prepare, and then attack again. So that's why a lot of countries want guarantees. Why? Because, and you said it correctly, they don't trust each other. What is the human situation in which trust is the most absent? Is war. War is the place where basically trust is gone, right? And so you need to recreate trust, and how you do it? You create mechanisms for trust. You cannot expect that two groups that have been fighting with each other for 20 years, all of a sudden they trust each other. You need to create systems that allow for them to check on each other. Right? That's why generally you want third parties, you create external tribunals, you create mechanisms, right, to say, okay, someone is checking on you, you check on me, and we can do that. So very often ceasefires come with some of these guarantees. Right? The good news is that on ceasefire, sometimes you can build a peace. Right? So you can go deeper, because ceasefires are good moments in which people start to kind of talk and reconnect. Right? And then you can build more. So again, I would always take a ceasefire versus no ceasefire. Although there are certain situations where things can be so bad that it's maybe not something that you want to do. So there are trade-offs, right? So I think that conversation comes with risks, right? And sometimes you're like, okay, I'll take what I can get, right? But that's not a good reason for not saying we should still work for that bigger goal. And I think that's exactly what you need to do on Ukraine and Russia. It's unthinkable that you just find a solution just by magic, right? You need to go by step, okay? Same for Gaza and Israel situation. You cannot just move from 100 to 0 overnight, right? So in this case, peace is a journey. Right? It's not an event.
Thank you, Professor. I think we would all be very happy to sit here all night and listen to you, but we have time for one more question, and then we'll close the evening.
Hi, so thank you for your really thought-provoking presentation. I'm in grade 10, Dover campus, and my question is, as a student, as an international student, what can we do? Because when you hear all of this, and it's really inspiring, and I'm hearing about all of this important work that needs to be done to get to peace, what can we do as international students to help get there? Like, what does the work actually look like from a student's perspective? Thank you.
Well, I would say, first of all, you are in the right place, because you are in UWC. So you are immersed in a culture that is fostering these kind of conversations, but it's not just a culture. I mean, there are concrete things that you all do. I mean, Ivan just told us of his own experience. Someone else was talking about the UN module, etc. So I think that's a very good way of starting, right? I always say there's one takeaway from, I want to kind of bring peace, right? Be humble, right? It's a step-by-step thing, right? So, yes, you start from the right place. You go to a school that embraces this kind of way of thinking. My kids do the same. They're UWC students. So that's the first step, right? And then opportunities come. You cannot just show up in a country and say, hey, can I bring peace? That's not how it works, right? So you move these small steps, incremental steps, and you always go in a place with a humble sense. You're always from outside. You don't know. People there know. They have experiences violence. They know more than you know, right? But maybe what you know is to help them to organize the way they do certain things. Sometimes you can bring money, resources, knowledge, right? That's great, right? But fundamentally, I would say you tap into their own knowledge. You just take it out, right? Because they know. People know how to solve this problem. Sometimes it's just the politics of it that is not there, right? So then you move. When you grow up, you go to university, you get your master, etc. Then you are in positions where you can actually influence certain decisions, right? And that was, for me, was very gratifying in the United Nations, where I've seen that you can actually make a difference. You can influence people to make certain decisions that have repercussion on hundreds of thousands of lives, right? But it comes with time, right? So you are in the right place and you're doing the right things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Mancini. I just want to say on behalf of all of us how much we appreciate your words this evening. As an Irish woman, it was particularly moving to see my Taoiseach Bertie Ahern and, of course, Tony Blair there with George Mitchell in 1998, which brought peace to my country. I think there were many things said tonight that were very interesting. One thing that I really take away is when you said that it is your empathy to put yourself in the shoes of others that is your key competence in peace building. And at the end of the day, it comes down to people. And I think that this is really key for us as a community at UWC. You said that peace is work, and I think we're all very committed to that work. And I'd like to thank you again for your time. Also, thank you to Lauti, to Lakshana, Sumeda, and Ivan for your time this evening. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Really appreciate your time this evening.